The dust of Colorado was a particular shade of red in September, not the soft amber of summer, not the pale ochre of spring. September dust in the high country was the color of old blood kicked up by boots that had walked the same hard ground for 19 years and were now walking it for the last time. Colt Hadley did not look back. He had made that decision before the doors of the meeting house had even closed behind him, before the sound of Reverend Vane's final words had finished echoing off the timber walls, before the last of the congregation had turned their faces away. He had decided in that precise moment, when the world he had known since birth had folded itself closed like a book being shut, that he would not give them the satisfaction of watching him look back. So he walked. The main road of dry stone ran perfectly straight for a quarter-mile before it curved west toward the canyon country, and Colt walked every inch of that straight section, with his eyes fixed on the horizon, on the blue-gray mountains that rose in the distance like the promises of a better world. Behind him, the settlement of Dry Stone sat in the morning light, 200 souls going about their morning, as if nothing of consequence had happened, as if a young man had not just been stripped of every belonging and every future he had ever imagined for himself, as if justice had simply been served. The mule Buck walked beside him, a gray animal thickly built with the steady patience of a creature that has seen enough of human foolishness to stop being surprised by it. Behind him, the settlement of Dry Stone sat in the morning light, 200 souls going about their morning as if nothing of consequence had happened. Someone had tied Buck's lead rope to the hitching post outside the meeting house. Sometime during the proceedings had loaded the animal's back with a worn canvas pack, a heavy felling axe with a head that gleamed like it had been oiled and sharpened the night before, and a rough sewn sack that smelled of salt pork and hardtack. Colt had not looked to see who had done it. He suspected he knew. The axe was too well tended, the knots too deliberately tied for it to be the work of a stranger or an afterthought. Someone had planned for this. Someone had seen what was coming before Colt himself had fully understood it, and they had done the only thing they could do, which was to make sure he did not walk out of Drystone with nothing but the clothes on his back. He ran his thumb along the edge of the axe head as he walked. Sharp enough to split a thought in half, sharp enough maybe to build something from the wreckage of a life. He held on to that idea. He needed to hold on to something. Drystone had not always been a place of hard edges and harder judgments. In the years when Colt was very young, barely old enough to carry water buckets without spilling more than he delivered, the settlement had felt like something almost generous. A collection of 60 or 70 families who had come west from Ohio and Kentucky and the worn-out farmlands of Pennsylvania. People who had decided that the high country of Colorado offered something the crowded East could not, which was space enough to build a life on your own terms. They had arrived in wagons, most of them in the years just after the war, and they had laid out their town with the methodical care of people who understood that the wilderness did not forgive carelessness. They cleared land, they built a mill and a storehouse and a meeting house. They planted orchards in the rocky soil of the valley floor and coaxed crops from ground that had never been turned by a plow. And somewhere in the early years of that work, Reverend Silas Vane had arrived. No one spoke much about where he had come from. He was simply there one spring. A tall man with iron-gray hair and eyes the color of a clouded sky carrying a worn Bible, and a voice that seemed to have been constructed specifically for the purpose of filling large spaces with certainty. He was 58 years old now, or close enough to it, and he had been a part of Dry Stone for so long that most of its current residents could not remember a time before him. He had not seized power. That was the thing people who had not witnessed it would never fully understand. He had simply made himself indispensable. When the mill broke down in the first hard winter, it was Vane who organized the repair crews and kept men working through the cold. When a family's crops failed, it was Vane who managed the distribution from the community storehouse, who decided with quiet authority who received what and how much. When disputes arose between neighbors, people stopped going to the elected town council and started going to the meeting house instead. Because Vane's decision stuck in a way that council votes somehow never quite managed to. By the time people realized what had happened, it had already happened. Drystone did not have a tyrant. It had a shepherd. And like most shepherds, Reverend Silas Vane understood that the gentlest form of control was the one that made the sheep feel protected rather than contained. Colt had understood this with an instinctive, wordless clarity for years, the way a person understands weather before they learn the names of the clouds. He had grown up as the community's charity case, the orphan boy whose parents had both died of fever in his third year of life, leaving him to be passed between households on a rotating basis until he was old enough to make himself useful in the fields and the barns and the workshop. He had learned early that his position in Dry Stone was not guaranteed. He had no blood claim to anyone's loyalty. He had no family land that would eventually come to him. He had no inheritance waiting behind the wall of childhood. What he had was his labor and his word. And for 19 years he had given both without complaint. He had thought in the naive way of young men who have been raised in one place and know no other measuring stick that this was enough, that a community built on the idea of shared work and shared faith would count 19 years of honest effort as a kind of membership, as belonging. He had been wrong about that. The thing that had started it all was an apple. It sounds small. It sounds like the kind of detail that gets softened in the retelling, rounded down into something almost comic, a disagreement over fruit that somehow spiraled beyond its origins. But in a community like Dry Stone, where the storehouse and its contents were managed with the precision of a bank ledger, where every bushel and every barrel was counted and accounted for theft from the communal stores, was not a small thing. It was a declaration. It was an act of taking from the collective, of putting your own hunger above the shared winter supply of 200 people. It was the kind of offense that Reverend Vane took very seriously. Declan Holt was 10 years old. He was a small boy with a shock of red hair and a mouth full of gaps where his adult teeth were still growing in. And he had the look that certain children have of being perpetually on the edge of something, either laughter or disaster, and never quite sure which way it would fall. His mother was a widow. His father had died 2 years earlier of a crushed chest when a horse panicked in the barn. The family had less than most. Colt had been in the storehouse on an errand, retrieving a coil of rope for one of the barn repairs he had been tasked with that morning when he saw it happen. Not Declan Holt, Jasper Vane. Jasper was 22, the Reverend's only son, a broad-shouldered young man with his father's coloring and none of his father's subtlety. He was reaching into the apple barrel with the casual ownership of someone accustomed to taking what he wanted from rooms he felt entitled to occupy. He pulled out 2 apples, pocketed one bit into the other, and walked out through the storehouse's back door without once checking to see if he was observed. He had not checked carefully enough. Colt stood very still for a moment, holding his coil of rope. He thought about what he had seen. He thought about Declan Holt and his mother and the gap-toothed boy's red hair. He thought about the way Dry Stone worked the machinery of it, the invisible gears that turned behind every public decision. He was not naive. He understood that what he was about to do carried risk. He understood it with a crystalline, adult clarity that was unusual for his age, and came from having spent 19 years watching from the margins of a community he had never quite been permitted to join. He went to the meeting house anyway. The congregation assembled that evening for what Reverend Vane called a community accounting, which was his term for the proceedings he conducted when the ledger of communal life required balancing. People came in from the fields and the barns, shaking the work from their hands and their faces, finding their places on the long wooden benches with the comfortable familiarity of people who had done this many times before. Declan Holt sat in the front row with his mother, his red head very still. The boy had been told to sit and not speak. He was not told why. Reverend Vane stood at the front of the room. He was not a large man in the physical sense, not imposing in the way that men who rely on their bodies tend to be. But he had the quality of taking up whatever space he occupied completely. He moved through rooms like weather moves through a valley. You felt his presence before you saw him, and you adjusted to it without deciding to. He spoke about the missing apples with the same deliberate gravity he brought to every pronouncement. He spoke about community trust. He spoke about the particular poison of theft, how it corroded the bonds between people, how it declared the thief's personal appetite more important than the shared survival of all. His voice was a deep, resonant instrument trained by decades of use to hit exactly the emotional frequency he needed. And the congregation responded to it the way they always did, with the attentive solemnity of people who had learned that the Reverend's words deserved their full weight. He named Declan Holt. The boy's mother made a small sound, and then Colt Hadley stood up. He had not rehearsed what he was going to say. He stood with the straightness of someone who had made a decision and was now simply executing it. And he said in a voice that carried clearly to the back of the room that Declan Holt had not taken the apples. He said he had been in the storehouse. He said he had seen who had actually taken them. He spoke the name of Jasper Vane with the same plain simplicity with which he might have identified a tool or a direction or any other simple fact of the observable world. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Colt had ever heard. It was not the silence of disbelief. It was not the silence of shock. It was a more particular silence than either of those, the silence of a room full of people who understood immediately and completely what had just been said and what it meant, and who were each in their own private way waiting to see what Reverend Vane was going to do about it. The Reverend's expression did not change. That was the thing Colt would remember most clearly in the years that followed. Not anger, not outrage, not the flushing heat of a man caught in something uncomfortable. The Reverend simply adjusted the fall of his coat collar with one hand, a small, precise gesture, and looked at Colt with eyes that were as calm and as cold as deep water. And then he smiled. It was a brief smile, barely a flicker, the kind of expression that on another face in another context might have been mistaken for acknowledgement, or even for a moment of genuine connection. But Colt had been watching Reverend Vane for 19 years, and he understood with a stomach-dropping certainty exactly what that smile meant. It meant that the Reverend was not afraid of what Colt had said. It meant that the Reverend had already decided what was going to happen next. In the third row of the congregation, Jasper Vane sat with his hands folded on his knees. He did not look at Colt. He did not look at his father. He looked at the floor in front of him, with the fixed, careful attention of a man watching a situation he has caused unfold in a direction he cannot stop, and has decided not to try. What happened next took the rest of the evening and was conducted with the careful architecture of a man who knew exactly how to shape a narrative in real time and had done so many times before. Vane did not deny what Colt had said. He did not raise his voice. He did not call Colt a liar with any of the direct bluntness that would have been easy to push back against. What he did instead was something more sophisticated and in its way more devastating. He acknowledged that Colt believed he had seen something. He spoke gently about the way young men of Colt's particular background, young men without the anchoring stability of family, without the guiding influence of parents who might have instilled proper judgment and humility, sometimes developed what he called a hunger for significance, a need to matter that outpaced their wisdom, a tendency to reach for importance in ways that caused harm to others, that cast unfounded shadows on the innocent, in an attempt to draw attention to themselves. He spoke about pride. He spoke about the particular spiritual danger of a young man who had been given much by a community and had perhaps begun to mistake that generosity for a kind of personal authority he had not earned. He never called Colt a liar. He simply rebuilt the room around Colt's statement, until the statement itself had been quietly walled off, contained, rendered harmless by the structure of interpretation that Vane constructed around it. By the time the Reverend finished speaking, Declan Holt's guilt had become an administrative matter, easily resolved, while Colt's statement had become something else entirely, something larger and more troubling, something that spoke to a deeper problem that the community needed to address. The vote, when it came, was conducted without anger and without ceremony. Colt Hadley was asked to leave Drystone. The community required a season of separation. The Reverend explained to allow healing and to allow a young man to reflect on the nature of pride and the obligations of gratitude. There was a place in the Canyon country to the west where those who needed separation found solitude. It was a known place. Not comfortable perhaps, but sufficient for a man of Colt's evident strength and resourcefulness. He was to go there. He was not to return. The congregation watched him as he left, not with cruelty. That was almost the hardest part. They watched him with the mild, compassionate solemnity of people who believed, genuinely believed, that what was happening was right, that it was in fact the merciful response to a difficult situation. They had been shaped by 20 years of Silas Vane's patient, careful work, and the shape they now inhabited left no room for the alternative interpretation of what Colt had told them. He walked out of the meeting house into the night air of September. He did not look back then either. Buck was waiting at the hitching post, as he had already known Buck would be. The pack was loaded. The axe gleamed in the last light. Colt ran his eyes over what had been given to him. Whoever had done this had thought it through. There was hardtack wrapped in oilcloth salt pork, a coil of good hemp rope, a smaller hand tool for working stone, and the axe. There was also a folded square of canvas that could serve as a ground cover or a lean-to in emergency. Modest provisions, enough to give a man a foothold if a man knew how to use a foothold. He was still standing there, checking the pack's contents with methodical hands, when he heard the footstep behind him. He turned. Ren Dawes was 21 years old, the son of the settlement's blacksmith. A broad young man with a serious face that did not often find its way to smiling, but when it did, meant it completely. He and Colt had grown up in the peculiar parallel way of boys in small communities. Not exactly raised together, but raised alongside each other, in proximity close enough that they knew each other's habits and silences as well as brothers might, without ever having needed to formally call themselves friends, because the word would have been redundant. Ren was standing in the shadow between the meeting house and the storehouse, his hat in his hands, his face doing something complicated that involved several emotions fighting for the same square inch of expression. Colt looked at him for a moment. "You loaded buck." It was a statement, not an accusation. Ren said nothing for a beat. Then, "Sharpened that axe last night. Figured you might need a good edge wherever you ended up." Colt nodded. He looked at the axe in his hands and then back at Ren. "You could come." The words were out before he had fully considered them, not because he expected Ren to say yes, but because some honest part of him needed to say it needed to make the offer real, so that what came next could not be misunderstood. Ren's jaw tightened. His eyes went briefly to the ground, the way a man's eyes go when he is looking at something painful that is laid out flat and unavoidable. His father was inside the meeting house. His mother. His younger sister Ida, who was 12, and who trusted the world the way 12-year-olds do, completely and without reservation. "I can't," Ren said. "I know." They stood in the cooling dark for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then Ren looked up, and his voice when it came was quieter, but had in it the quality of something that had been thought through carefully, a thing chosen and meant. "The axe is sharp enough to build a world, Colt. Don't waste it on anger." Colt looked at him. He took the lead rope and turned Buck toward the western road. He did not say goodbye. The word would not have fit what stood between them in that moment. What stood between them was too solid for words to go around, and too important to cheapen with the conventional gesture of departure. He simply walked, and Ren Dawes stood in the shadow and watched him go until the darkness took him. Old May Whitfield's cabin was the last structure on the western edge of Drystone, set back from the road by 30 yards, and partially screened from view by a stand of scrub oak that had grown up around it over the years, as if the trees were deliberately providing cover. The cabin was small, its walls darkened by weather, its roof patched in 3 distinct places with different materials that testified to the different seasons in which repairs had been made. Old May herself was an anomaly in Drystone, which was perhaps why she and her cabin sat on the settlement's edge rather than its center. She was somewhere past 70, though she had never confirmed a precise age to anyone who asked. And she had been in the canyon country longer than Reverend Vane had been in the settlement, longer perhaps than most of the current residents could trace. She was a midwife by practice and an herbalist by knowledge, and the community's relationship with her was the particular kind of pragmatic ambivalence that practical people develop towards someone whose skills they need, but whose independence they cannot quite accommodate. Vane tolerated her. He did not endorse her. He managed the community's access to her the way a man manages a useful but unpredictable tool carefully, and with one hand always available to put it away. May had delivered half the children currently living in Drystone. She had also eased with dignity and herbal knowledge more of the old and the sick than any formal physician the community had ever managed to secure. She knew roots and barks and the specific properties of plants that grew in the rocky soil of the Colorado high country, knowledge she had assembled over decades from sources she did not enumerate. Colt had not expected her to be outside. She was standing at her fence line in the pre-dawn gray, wearing a heavy wool shawl over her shoulders, her white hair pinned back under a dark bonnet, her hands folded in front of her, with the patience of a woman who had been waiting for some time and had decided not to be impatient about it, as if she had known he was coming. As if she had known, perhaps before the meeting house proceedings had even concluded, that this night would end with Colt Hadley walking west and that his path would take him past her fence. "Didn't expect company," Colt said, slowing his step. "No," the old woman said. "I don't suppose you did." She reached into the pocket of her shawl and withdrew 2 things. The first was a small cloth bag tied at the top, with a thin piece of cord that smelled even from 3 feet away of dried bark and dried leaves, and the complex earthen fragrance of plant medicines that had been carefully stored. The second was a stone. It was small enough to sit in the palm of a hand. Dark, almost black, polished to a smoothness that did not look natural, that looked instead like something that had been handled for a very long time, turned over and over in thousands of moments of thought, and simply the restless movement of fingers that needed something solid to hold on to. She held both out to Colt. He took the cloth bag first because that made practical sense and tucked it into the pack on Buck's back where it would be protected. Then he took the stone. It sat in his palm with a settled weight, small but substantial. He closed his fingers around it. The stone was warm, faintly, almost imperceptibly warm in a way that made no immediate sense given the cool air of the September night. He turned it over in his fingers, feeling the smoothness of it the way it had been worn by long handling into something that fit a human hand, as though it had been shaped for exactly that purpose. "May," he said. He was not sure what he intended to follow that. A question, perhaps, or simply the acknowledgement that she deserved her name spoken with the gravity the moment required. "Listen," she said, as if he had asked his question and she was answering it. "I know you don't know yet what that means, but there's a place in Hollow Wind Canyon where the rock is not what it looks like, where it remembers something older than the mountain it sits in." Her eyes, dark and steady, found his in the dim light. "They see a grave, boy. That's what they're giving you. They think they're putting you somewhere things end." She paused, and when she continued, her voice dropped to something barely above the sound of the wind. "Stone remembers fire. Listen for its warmth. And when you find it, don't be afraid of what you're holding." Colt stood with the stone in his closed fist. He wanted to say that he didn't know what any of that meant. He wanted to say that he was a 19-year-old man with a mule and an axe and the narrow margin of a survival problem to solve, and that he did not have room in that problem for riddles, however kindly meant. But old May Whitfield was looking at him with an expression that was not asking for his understanding. She was simply giving him something. The same way Wren had given him the axe, the same way Buck's steady presence was a kind of giving. Each of them had handed him a piece of what the morning would require, and it was not his place to evaluate the worth of each gift before he accepted it. "Thank you," he said. The old woman nodded, once unfolded her hands, and turned back toward her cabin door. She did not watch him leave. She was already done with the farewell, had perhaps conducted it internally long before Colt arrived, and was now simply returning to whatever her evenings contained. Colt put the stone in his coat pocket where his fingers could find it. He walked west. The journey to Hollow Wind Canyon took 6 hours through country that revealed itself in stages as the September sun climbed. The first 2 hours were through land that Colt knew, the grazing flats east of the canyon country, where drystones herds summered the rocky creek beds that marked the seasonal water paths. The scattered groves of aspen already beginning to turn in the early autumn cool, their leaves going from green to the pale gold that would deepen over the next 3 weeks into the blaze of color that the high country put on like a final extravagance before winter. He had worked this land in every season of his 19 years. He knew which rocks hid the best fishing holes, which slopes caught the morning sun earliest, which draws collected the snowmelt longest in a dry spring. This landscape was built into him the way language is built into a person below the level of decision, simply present a part of the structure of knowing. He was leaving it. He did not think about that with the full weight of what it meant. He filed it somewhere behind the immediate practical requirements of the day and kept walking. The third and fourth hours were through rougher country, where the canyon system began and the flat grazing land folded itself into the vertical world of red and gray rock, narrow passages, and the sudden deep drops that the Colorado Plateau specialized in. The wind picked up here, funneled by the canyon walls into something more purposeful than the open country breeze he had been walking through. Buck's hooves found the rocky trail with careful, deliberate steps. The fifth and sixth hours were the hard ones. Not physically harder than the earlier miles, though the trail climbed in places, and the footing was uncertain. Harder in the particular way that the final stretch of a long walk is always harder when the destination is known and close, and the mind is no longer sustained by the middle distance goal, but must instead deal with the arrival itself and everything arrival implies. Hollow Wind Canyon opened ahead of him in the late afternoon. The shadow of its walls fell across the trail like a threshold. On one side, the last light of the September sun on pale rock and autumn aspen. On the other side, the deep blue-gray of canyon shade the narrowing of sky to a ribbon overhead, the drop in temperature that came immediately and completely as he stepped into the canyon's influence. He walked another quarter-mile along the canyon floor, following the shallow creek that ran along its bed before he saw it. The cave was not hidden. It was simply there in the east wall of the canyon, an opening in the limestone that was larger than he had expected. Perhaps 20 feet wide at its broadest and 12 feet high at the center, fringed along its upper edge with the skeletal fingers of wind-shaped junipers that had somehow found purchase in the rock. Its interior was dark in the way that deep things are dark. Not the absence of light, but the presence of a different quality of space, one that had never been organized around human needs. Buck stopped, not with the balking stubbornness of a frightened animal, but with the considered pause of one registering information and waiting for a decision. His ears moved forward and then back forward again. His nostrils widened. Then he stood quietly, breath clouding in the cooling air, waiting for Colt to lead. Colt stood beside him. He looked at the cave's mouth for a long moment. He looked at the way the last light of the afternoon caught the canyon walls above it, turning the red rock to something almost luminous. He looked at the thin thread of the creek at his feet and traced it mentally back to where it emerged from the base of the canyon wall, a reliable source potentially. The Reverend had called this place a destination for those who needed separation. He had used the civilized vocabulary of reflection and community healing. But what he had meant, what the entire proceeding had been aimed at communicating, was that Hollow Wind Canyon was where things ended. It was where dry stone sent its problems to be absorbed by the wilderness. It was where Colt Hadley was supposed to become the name of someone who used to live among them. A cautionary lesson invoked occasionally when young men needed reminding of the cost of pride. Colt put his hand in his coat pocket. The stone was there. He had been aware of it all day, a small solid presence that his fingers returned to without thinking. He held it now in his palm and felt what he had first noticed when Old May had handed it to him. That faint, unlikely warmth, a temperature that had no reasonable explanation in a small piece of dark rock carried through a cool September day. He could not explain it. He put it back in his pocket. He took Buck's lead rope in his hand, pulled gently, and walked into the dark. That first night in the cave was the longest of his life. He did not light a fire. The wood near the entrance was damp from a recent rain, and more practically, he had no clear sense yet of what moved in this canyon at night. What drew to fire, what did not. And he preferred to understand his situation better before announcing himself with light. He found the shallowest part of the cave's entrance, a curved alcove where the rock pulled back from the prevailing wind direction. And he settled Buck there with the last of the hardtack and a hand resting briefly on the animal's neck before he moved away. Then he sat down against the stone. The night came fully and completely in the way that canyon nights come, not a gradual darkening, but a sudden deep blue that dropped the temperature 10 degrees in an hour, and brought with it a sky so crowded with stars that the absence of a moon barely registered. The Milky Way was a river overhead, visible through the framed mouth of the cave, and a coyote called once from somewhere up canyon, the sound lifting and curling in the cold air before the rock walls absorbed it. Colt sat with his back against the stone and his knees drawn up and the axe across his thighs. He did not allow himself to think about dry stone. Not yet. Those thoughts were available to him, lined up and waiting, and he knew they would have to be faced in time. But not tonight. Tonight he needed something else. He let his mind go quiet, or as quiet as a mind can go when the bottom has just dropped out from under 19 years of assumption. In the quiet, he began to plan. Water first. He had heard the creek outside and knew the canyon had a source, but a creek could be seasonal, could fail in a dry winter. He needed to know what else was available. The cave itself would need to be understood, mapped, assessed for what it could provide and what it could not. Shelter was already partially solved, but partially was not completely. And a Colorado winter at altitude was not something that could be survived on partial solutions. He would need walls, a door, a fire that could be maintained safely, and draw efficiently without filling the interior with smoke. He would need, in other words, to build. His thumb found the edge of the axe head in the dark, sharp enough to build a world. He did not sleep for a long time, but when he did sleep, it was the sleep of a man who had made a list, who had a first step and a second step and a third step, who had looked at the situation with clear eyes and found that it was hard but not impossible. Which is the only finding that matters when you are sitting with your back against a cold stone wall and the only warmth you have is the weight of a borrowed axe and a small dark stone in your coat pocket. That should have been cold, and somehow was not. He slept, and the canyon held him in its silence, indifferent in the way that only very old things can be indifferent. Not cruel, not kind, simply present and unmoved. Which was, he would later understand, exactly what he had needed. Not comfort, not forgiveness, not the warm conditional embrace of a community that would take you back if you performed the right contrition. Just the cold weight of the canyon around him, something vast and ancient that asked nothing, and therefore could not be disappointed. The first morning of the rest of his life would come with the light. He would be ready for it. The first morning came gray and cold with a frost on the canyon floor that turned the creek's edge to silver and made the red rock walls look pale and distant, like something seen through old glass. Colt was already awake when the light came. He had been awake for an hour before it, sitting in the same position he had fallen asleep in, back against the cave wall, axe across his knees, watching the dark at the cave's mouth slowly resolve itself into the blue-gray of pre-dawn. He had slept in intervals, waking to listen, cataloging the sounds of the canyon the way a careful man catalogs the sounds of any new territory he needs to understand in order to survive it. The coyote had called twice more during the night, each time from a different direction, which told him there was more than one, and that they moved widely. An owl had worked the canyon for a while in the deep hours before dawn. Something larger, deer, probably had crossed the creek bed 50 yards east of the cave entrance around midnight. The sound of its hooves on wet stone, brief, and then gone. Nothing had approached the cave. He stood, worked the stiffness from his back with both hands, and went to check on Buck. The mule had passed the night standing in the same spot where Colt had tethered him, one rear leg cocked. He turned his head when Colt approached, regarded him with one large dark eye, and produced a low sound in his chest that was somewhere between acknowledgement and complaint. "Morning," Colt said. Buck's ear moved in response. Colt untethered him and led him out of the cave into the thin early light down to the creek, where Buck drank with the long steady pull of a thirsty animal, while Colt knelt beside him and cupped the water in his hands. It was cold enough to ache. It tasted of minerals, of deep rock, of a source that was not the snowmelt surface runoff of high summer, but something older and more reliable. He drank until his hands were numb. Then he straightened, wiped his hands on his coat, and looked at the canyon around him with the deliberate attention of a man taking inventory. It was longer than he had expected, stretching north and south along the creek for at least a mile in each direction before the walls curved out of sight. The floor was maybe 200 yards wide at its broadest, narrowing in places to half that, covered in a mix of limestone rubble, thin rocky soil, and the occasional patch of coarse grass that had managed to establish itself in the more sheltered corners. On the north end of the valley, visible even from here as a darker mass against the canyon wall, was a stand of timber lodgepole pines growing in a thick congregation that represented to Colt's eye enough building material for a small structure if he was careful about how he used it. The cave itself behind him now anchored the east wall at roughly the canyon's midpoint. He turned and looked at it in the morning light. It was larger than he had processed the night before, when he had been operating on exhaustion and the narrow focus of immediate shelter. The entrance was generous, wide, and high enough that Buck could have walked in without ducking. The rock around it was the gray limestone that composed most of this canyon country, weathered and seamed, but solid, built by geological time into something that would outlast any human structure laid against it. He walked back inside and went deeper than he had gone the night before, holding a pine branch he had lit from the flint and steel tucked in the canvas pack. The torch throwing a dancing amber light that made the walls move and breathe with shadow. The first chamber was the main one, roughly oval, perhaps 40 feet across at its widest. The ceiling domed above him at a height that cleared his head by 8 feet at the center and sloped down toward the walls. The floor was uneven, but not impossible limestone rubble that could be cleared and leveled with enough effort. The air was still and cool but dry, which surprised him. He had expected damp. A narrow passage at the back of the main chamber led after 10 feet of compression that required him to turn sideways into a second room. He stopped just inside the entrance of it. The sound was what he noticed first. A steady, patient sound in the silence of the deep cave, rhythmic and small and entirely distinct from the dead quiet of the first chamber. He held the torch still and listened, and after a moment he placed it water. Moving water, the soft, deliberate tick of a drip falling into a still pool. He moved the torch around until he found the source. In the far corner of the second chamber, The ceiling had a fissure running across it, perhaps 6 inches wide, and from this fissure, water seeped steadily down the rock face and collected in a natural basin formed by a depression in the floor. The basin was perhaps the size of a wash basin, filled to within an inch of its rim, with water so clear that the torch flame reflected in it without distortion. Colt knelt beside it. He put his fingers in, cold enough to make his breath catch clean without the surface smell of standing water that had gone stale. He tasted it. Minerals again, the deep rock flavor that had been in the creek but cleaner, more concentrated. He sat back on his heels in the second chamber of the cave in Hollow Wind Canyon and let himself feel for one quiet moment the specific quality of relief that comes not from a problem being solved, but from a problem being survivable. He was not going to die of thirst. The cave had given him that without being asked, without negotiation, without the conditional generosity of people who give and then count the gift against what they are owed. The stone had simply offered what it had, and Colt accepted it with the gratitude of a man who understood the difference between charity and the impersonal grace of the natural world. He stood up and went deeper. There was a third chamber. Beyond the water room, another passage shorter and wider than the first opened into a space that was smaller than the main chamber, but higher, ceiling the dome above him, rising to a point he could not fully see in the torchlight. The floor here was flat and the walls were smoother than the rough limestone of the outer rooms. And in the far corner, unmistakable even under the accumulated grime of what looked like decades of abandonment, he found the evidence. A fire pit, not a natural feature. A deliberate construction, a ring of stones set with the intentional hand of someone who had understood the principles of containing fire, positioned beneath a natural chimney in the ceiling that would carry smoke upward and away. Around the pit, in the dust of the third chamber's floor, a scatter of small objects. He knelt and examined them without touching. Flint points. 4 of them in various stages of completion, as if someone had been working them and set them down with the intention of returning, and never had. A fragment of something that might once have been a leather strap, dried now to a rigid curl. A scattering of bone fragments, fire-blackened, that had once been the remains of something eaten in this room. Colt looked at these things for a long time. He was not the first person who had needed this place. He did not know who had come before him, what circumstances had driven them to this canyon and this cave, what they had built here or failed to build, what had ultimately taken them away from the fire ring and the unfinished flint points. He did not know their story, but he knew with a certainty that settled into him like the cold, clean water of the second chamber had settled into his thirst that this place had a history of sheltering people who needed sheltering. That the walls of this cave had stood around human survival before and had not objected to it. He was not a man being deposited in a grave. He was a man being added to a line of people who had found in the same stone walls the particular gift of a place that asks nothing and therefore cannot disappoint. He went back to the main chamber and then back to the entrance and stood in the cave's mouth in the morning light looking at the canyon spread before him. At the timber to the north, at the creek running clear over its rocky bed, at the pale sky above the canyon walls, where a hawk was working a thermal with the patient ease of something that had all the time in the world. He had water, he had shelter, he had fuel for fire if he worked for it, he had game in the canyon. He had seen the signs of rabbit runs along the creek bank, the pressed grass trails and the scattered evidence that mapped a network of small animal paths through the valley floor. He had a foothold, and a foothold for a man who had been building everything in his life from nothing was enough to start. He picked up the axe. The work of the first 2 weeks was the work of pure survival, and it consumed every hour of the light and most of his capacity for thought. He built his fire management system first, establishing a controlled fire at the cave entrance using the driest wood he could find, learning in the first evening how to read the cave's draft, the way air moved through the chambers and out, understanding that the cave breathed in a specific pattern that could be used or opposed depending on where he positioned a flame. By the 3rd day, he had a fire that worked with the cave's natural ventilation rather than against it, burning cleanly and drawing its smoke out efficiently. He built a shelter for Buck in the lee of the canyon wall just south of the cave entrance, a 3-sided windbreak of stacked stone and pine branches that was not elegant but was effective. Buck accepted this arrangement by walking into it, turning around once, and standing with his head lowered and his eyes half closed, which Colt took as approval. He laid snares along the rabbit runs he had identified. By the fifth morning, he had 2 rabbits, and he ate the first real hot meal he had had since Drystone, sitting cross-legged at his cave entrance fire in the early morning quiet. He ate without haste and without the complicated feelings he had half expected to have. He simply ate, and the food was good, and the fire was warm, and the canyon was quiet around him. On the seventh morning, he woke up and understood with a clarity that felt like something physical shifting in his chest that he was not going to survive this winter on snares and hardtack. He needed walls. He needed a door against the wind. He needed a chimney and a hearth that would hold heat through the nights that were already dropping below freezing, and would within 6 weeks be capable of killing a man who slept without adequate shelter. He needed to build. The plan came to him while he was standing inside the main chamber, turning slowly, looking at the space with the measuring eye he had developed over years of repair work in dry stone. It arrived not as a single idea, but as a sequence of recognitions, each one leading to the next, with the logical inevitability of a well-constructed argument. The cave entrance was already a wall on 3 sides. The rock formed the east wall, the south wall, and the ceiling. What the cave lacked was a west wall, the open face that looked out onto the canyon, and a north wall to close the corner. Build those 2 walls from timber, fill the gaps with clay and moss, hang a door, and you had a room. A real room with the cave stone providing insulation on 3 sides that no constructed building could match. A hearth against the back wall of the cave, positioned directly beneath one of the chimney fissures he had identified, would draw smoke up and out through the mountain itself. He would not be living in a cave. He would be living in a cabin that the mountain had already built halfway. It was the most efficient construction plan he had ever conceived, and it had taken him a week of living inside the problem to see it. He stood in the cave's main chamber with the plan assembled in his mind, turning it over, checking it for flaws, finding none that could not be worked around. And he felt something he had not felt since the meeting house door had closed behind him. He felt interested. Not happy, not exactly, not at peace, but genuinely practically engaged in the problem in front of him. The grief was still there. The anger, the complex residue of 19 years of belonging, followed by the abrupt removal of that belonging. But those things had been placed temporarily and by necessity into a room of their own, and that room was currently closed, and in the room he was standing in, there was only the problem and the plan, and the morning light coming through the cave entrance, and the axe in his hand. He walked north toward the timber. The felling of trees was the hardest physical work Colt had ever done. He had helped with barn raisings in dry stone, had spent weeks of his youth clearing scrub and timber from land being opened for cultivation. He knew the mechanics of the work, the angles of the cuts, the way a tree's lean dictated its fall, the reading of grain and tension that separated a controlled fell from a dangerous one. But he had always done that work with other men, with the rhythm of multiple axes, with the shared labor of a crew that distributed the effort across many bodies and many hours. He had never done it alone day after day against a quota set by the approaching winter and the requirements of a structure that needed to be completed before the first serious snowfall. He did it alone now. He rose each morning before full light and ate quickly whatever the snares had provided, or the last of the hardtack when they had not, and walked north to the timber stand with the axe on his shoulder. He selected trees with care, choosing the straightest and most uniform of the lodgepole trees that would stack with minimum gaps and maximum stability. He made his cuts with the deliberation of someone who had no replacement for a mistake, no crew to compensate for an error in judgment, only one axe and one body, and the specific number of daylight hours that September in Colorado provided. Buck was his hauling crew. Colt would fell a tree limb, it cut it to length, and then loop a length of rope around it, and hitch the other end to Buck's harness. The mule would lean into the load with the grinding, steady effort of an animal built for exactly this kind of work, dragging the log across the valley floor and up the gentle slope to the cave entrance where Colt would stack it and go back for the next one. They developed a rhythm, not a fast rhythm, not an efficient one by any standard that involved comparison, but a rhythm nonetheless. The kind that belongs to a working partnership between a man and an animal that understands shared work. His hands changed during those weeks. The blisters of the first days burst and healed, then burst again in different places as the work shifted and the grip adjusted. Then they healed into calluses, and the calluses thickened, and his hands became things he did not entirely recognize when he looked at them in the firelight. The hands of a man who was building something harder and rougher and more capable than the hands he had arrived with. He did not mind. the pile of logs grew. It was on the 11th day of felling, when he returned to the cave at midday to eat and rest his arms, that he paid real attention to the back wall for the first time. He had noticed it before. He would have been a poor observer not to, because the anomaly was visible even on casual inspection. The rear wall of the main chamber, the wall against which he planned to build his hearth, was different from the walls around it. The surrounding limestone was the standard grey, rough-textured, visibly porous in the way of sedimentary rock, its surface irregular and mapped with the fractures of long geological time. But this section, a roughly rectangular area perhaps 10 feet wide and 10 feet high, centered on the back wall, was something else. It was darker, almost charcoal in color, and smoother, the kind of smoothness that was not the absence of texture, but a different quality of surface altogether. Where the limestone looked like it had been assembled piece by piece over eons, this section looked formed as though it had arrived as a single piece from somewhere deeper in the mountain. On the 11th day, with his arms tired, and the midday light slanting through the cave entrance at an angle that struck the back wall, directly he saw something that made him stop chewing and look more carefully. The wall was warm. Not warm the way a wall near a fire is warm. His fire was at the cave entrance 30 feet away, and the heat it generated had never made a meaningful difference to the temperature of the back chamber. But when he crossed the chamber and placed his palm flat against the dark section of wall, there was warmth in it. Faint but real, a temperature distinctly different from the cold limestone on either side of it. He stood with his palm against the dark stone. The warmth did not increase. It simply persisted steady and even distributed evenly across the entire surface, as though the warmth were a property of the stone itself, rather than something being conducted to it from outside. He stepped back and looked at it. In the afternoon, when he returned from his second session of the day, he checked it again. Still warm. Warmer, if anything, than the midday check. On the next morning, with the dawn chill at its sharpest, he went to the wall first thing before the fire was lit. The surrounding limestone was cold in the way of stone in an enclosed space in a Colorado canyon in late September. But the dark section was warmer than the air in the chamber, measurably, undeniably warmer. He stood in front of it for a long time that morning, in the near dark before sunrise, with his breath making small clouds in the cold air, his palm flat against the dark stone. The old woman's words came back to him. Stone remembers fire. Listen for its warmth. He took the stone from his coat pocket, the small dark stone that old May had pressed into his hand at her fence line on the night he had left Dry Stone. He held it alongside his palm on the wall, feeling the weight of it. The same polished smoothness as the wall's surface, the same depth of color in the dim light. He had not thought about the comparison before. But looking at the stone in his hand and the wall in front of him, there was a kinship between them. He had been too preoccupied to notice. Same color, same smoothness, same quality of surface that suggested not the random chance of geology, but something more intentional. He put the stone back in his pocket and went back to work. But the wall remained in the back of his mind through the rest of the morning's felling, a question without a framework, present and unresolved. Waiting with the patience of something that has been waiting a very long time already and has no objection to waiting longer. 3 weeks into the construction, on a morning that arrived with an iron sky and the smell of coming weather, 2 men appeared at the south end of the canyon. Colt saw them before they saw him, which gave him the particular advantage of being able to observe before being observed. He recognized them both, Garrett Sully and Dale Marsh. Both men of Dry Stone, both men who had been in the meeting house on the evening of Colt's trial. Both of them members of the particular subset of the community that performed Reverend Vane's practical requirements without needing to have those requirements spelled out explicitly. They were not carrying supplies. They were carrying the casual body language of men who have been sent somewhere with a specific message and are confident in the authority that message carries. Colt came down from the slope at his own pace. He did not hurry and he did not slow down. He came down with the same rhythm he had used all morning, axe on his shoulder, his stride the stride of a man moving through land he has been working in and intends to keep working in. He stopped when he reached the cave entrance. He set the axe down against the rock wall within easy reach and turned to face them when they arrived. They looked at the pile of logs. They looked at Buck's windbreak, more solid now, and roofed with a layer of pine boughs. They looked at the cave entrance at the fire pit, with its organized ash at the organized neatness of a space that someone had been working with deliberate intention. Sully found his voice first. He said that the Reverend had been asking after Colt's situation, that the community wanted to be sure the terms of his separation were being honored, that it would be important for everyone involved, that there be no misunderstanding about the nature of the arrangement. It was careful language, practiced. The kind of language that carries a threat inside a statement of concern, the way a stone can be carried inside a closed fist. Colt looked at Sully and then at Marsh, taking his time with the look, letting it be the kind of look that does not pretend to be something other than what it is. Then he said quietly and without heat, "Tell the Reverend I'm building something here, something real, something that will still be standing after every word he ever said about me has turned to dust." He paused. "And tell him to keep his people out of my canyon." Marsh started to say something. Colt picked up the axe. Not quickly, not as a threat. Simply picked it up and held it in both hands in the way a man holds a tool he is about to return to using, as if the conversation had concluded in the only way it was going to conclude, and there was work to be done. Sully and Marsh left faster than they had arrived, and Colt watched them go until they rounded the south bend of the canyon and disappeared. Then he turned back to his work. His heart was steady in his chest. His hands were steady on the axe. He had not wasted it on anger. The cabin walls rose through October with the patient accumulation of days that all contained the same elements, and each contributed something necessary. Log by log, the structure took shape. Colt worked the notching by hand, cutting the locking corners with the careful geometry he had watched and memorized over years of observation, fitting each log to the one below it, with a closeness that left no room for the wind to find a channel. He chinked the gaps as he went, using a mix of clay from the creek bank and dried moss gathered from the shadowed sections of the canyon wall, where it grew in dark, dense mats. The door frame went up on what he calculated was a Tuesday based on the count of mornings since his arrival, which he had been marking on the cave wall with a piece of charred wood from the fire. It was during the work of clearing the base of the back wall, removing loose debris that had accumulated over what appeared to be decades of undisturbed time, that he picked up the small hand tool from the canvas pack and tapped lightly at the surface of the dark wall, intending only to remove a section that was in the way of the hearth placement. The outer layer fractured along a seam he had not seen a natural fault line in the mineral deposit, and a piece roughly the size of a dinner plate broke away and fell to the floor. Beneath it, exposed for what must have been the first time in an enormous span of time, was white. Not the gray white of limestone. A different white, dense and crystalline, catching the torchlight in a way that limestone never did, throwing it back with a faint internal luminescence that made the material seem lit from within. He knew what quartz looked like. He had seen it in the creek beds around dry stone, small pieces tumbled smooth. He had never seen it in a formation like this. A wall of it solid and enormous, hidden behind a thin shell of mineral deposit. He stood looking at the exposed patch for a long moment. Then he set down the hand tool and went back to work on the cabin walls. The quartz was a mystery. The cabin was a necessity. The winter was coming. But the mystery had lodged itself in his mind with the specific patient insistence of something that intends to be resolved. The chimney was the moment that changed everything. He had planned the hearth to sit against the back wall using the quartz formation as the chimney's rear face. It was while he was preparing this final section, clearing the last debris from the wall's base, that the hand tool slipped in his grip and struck the dark outer surface with more force than he had intended. A crack, a sharp sound. The dark outer layer had fractured along another natural fault line, and a piece much larger than the first broke away. Beneath it, exposed in an area 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, was the quartz. White crystalline, catching even the dim cave light and returning it multiplied and warm. He crouched. He brought the torch closer. The quartz was not uniform, running through its white mass, branching and rebranching in a pattern of extraordinary complexity, like the bare winter branches of a tree seen against a pale sky, like the tributaries of a river. Seen from a great height were threads of something else. Something that caught the torchlight differently than the quartz, did not reflecting it but absorbing it and returning it in a different register entirely. Yellow. A deep, rich, entirely unmistakable yellow that was not the pale gold of certain minerals or the trick of firelight on pale stone, but the specific saturated color of a metal that Colt had seen in coins and in the edges of the Reverend's Bible, and in the center of the small cross that hung above the door of the dry stone meeting house. He did not move for a very long time. He was aware of his own breathing. He was aware of the torch in his hand and the floor beneath his knees, and Buck moving somewhere outside, and the creek running distantly in the canyon below. He was aware of all these things with a strange heightened clarity, as if everything in the world had simultaneously become more real than it normally managed to be. He set the torch in a crack in the floor where it would stand unsupported. He picked up the hand tool. With more care than he had brought to any single action in his 19 years, he began to chip away more of the dark outer layer. It came away in pieces, each piece revealing more of the quartz beneath, and with the quartz always the threads. They were not small threads. As more of the dark shell fell away, what had appeared to be hairline veins revealed themselves as something altogether different. A network that grew more complex and more dense with each section of outer stone he removed, branching and connecting, filling the white quartz with a pattern of pure yellow that spread and expanded until he sat back on his heels and understood what he was actually looking at. Not a vein, not a seam. The entire wall, the complete 10-foot wide, 10-foot high section of anomalous dark stone that had puzzled him since his first night in this cave, was a single massive formation of gold-bearing quartz. The dark outer layer was a crust of mineral deposit built up over geological time that had formed a perfect concealing shell over what lay beneath. It had hidden the treasure so completely and for so long that the canyon, the mountain, the entire landscape above him had had no idea what it contained. Colt sat on the floor of the cave with chips of dark mineral around him, and the torch burning low in its crack and the exposed face of the quartz wall shining in the firelight like something from a story told by a man who had never actually expected anyone to believe him. He thought about the meeting house, about the rows of assembled faces turning away from him one by one, about the reverend's careful smile and the deliberate constructed architecture of his own condemnation. He thought about Wren's hands tying the knots on Buck's pack in the dark, and old May at her fence line in the pre-dawn gray pressing a stone into his palm and speaking words he had not yet had the context to understand. He thought about the specific words the Reverend had used when he described this place, the emphasis on its remoteness, the implication of its worthlessness, the careful, unhurried confidence of a man who was certain beyond any doubt that he was sending a problem somewhere, it would cease to be a problem. And then something broke open in his chest that was not quite grief, and not quite joy, and not quite rage, but contained elements of all three, and he laughed. The sound was enormous in the cave's enclosed space, bouncing off the quartz wall and off the limestone ceiling, and coming back to him changed, layered, as if the stone that remembered fire had been waiting a long time for exactly this moment and was not going to let it pass quietly. He laughed until his eyes were wet, sitting on the floor of a cave in Hollow Wind Canyon, in the high country of Colorado, with a fortune hidden in the wall behind him, and the voice of a dead settlement's self-appointed judge echoing in the back of his mind. The stone had remembered its fire. He had found it. The cabin was completed in late November, and it was finished just in time. The first serious snow came 3 days later, a light fall that dusted the canyon floor, and the cabin's new roof with 2 inches of white, and retreated by noon. Then a week of hard cold without precipitation, the kind of cold that locked the creek's edges in ice and turned the morning air to something that hurt to breathe too quickly. Then on a Sunday, the sky turned the particular shade of greenish-gray that Colt had learned to associate with serious weather, and the wind died to nothing, and the silence before the storm fell over the canyon like a held breath. The blizzard arrived that night. Colt had spent the day before it in frantic preparation, hauling wood until his arms gave out, filling every container he had with water from the spring. Before the fissure could freeze, checking and rechecking the cabin walls for gaps, applying a final round of clay chinking to the places he had been uncertain about. When the storm came, it came completely. The wind rose to a sustained howl that he could hear even through the cabin walls, and the cave stone, a sound that was in the register of something alive and furious. Snow drove against the door in sheets, and the temperature outside dropped to something he did not want to calculate. Inside, with the hearth going and the quartz wall radiating its strange steady heat at his back, the cabin held. He fed the fire through the night, sleeping in intervals, waking to add wood, listening to the storm through the walls and the roof and the mountain itself. Buck was in the cave's main chamber behind the cabin, separated from the hearth by the doorway Colt had cut in the interior wall, sheltered from the worst of the cold by the cave stone on all sides and the warmth that leaked through from the hearth. The mule stood in his corner and breathed his slow, patient breaths, ears relaxed entirely unbothered by the fury outside. By the second morning, the snow had reached the bottom of the cabin door. Colt worked at it from inside until he could open it, then cleared a path with a flat piece of wood, moving snow until he had access to the canyon floor and to the creek, which was still running in its deep central channel beneath the ice that had formed along its edges. He came back inside, barred the door, added wood to the fire, and sat down to wait out the second day of the storm. He was warm. He was fed the dried rabbit meat hanging from the cabin's rafters, providing adequate stores. He had water and fire and 4 solid walls and the mountain at his back. He looked at the quartz wall behind the hearth, the way the firelight played across its exposed sections, the way the golden threads caught the light and seemed to multiply it, throwing back more warmth and more color than the flame itself could account for. It was, he thought, the most beautiful thing he had ever seen in his life. He was sitting with that thought, with the fire's warmth and the quartz wall's impossible golden light, filling the small cabin with something that felt almost like peace when the sound came. Faint at first, competing with the storm's voice, ambiguous, easy to explain away, as the wind finding a new channel in the canyon walls, or the creak of timber under snow weight. Then it came again, louder. Someone was pounding on his door. Colt was on his feet before the sound had fully registered. His hand went to the axe on its wall hook. Then he was at the door, lifting the bar, pulling it inward against the resistance of packed snow. The night air hit him like a wall of knives, and out of the dark and the driven snow, a figure collapsed inward against his chest, followed immediately by a woman clutching something bundled against her coat with both arms, her face barely visible under the snow-matted cloth wrapped around her head, her eyes wide and desperate and human. Colt grabbed the falling man by the coat with one hand and stepped back, pulling him inside. The woman came through behind him, stumbling over the threshold, and Colt got the door shut and the bar down and turned to look at what the storm had delivered to him. A man on his floor trying to push himself upright with arms that were shaking badly. A woman against the wall with a bundle in her arms from which a small face was visible, pale and slack, with a stillness that was not sleep. A child. The man got one arm under himself and raised his face. He was perhaps 35, or had been before the storm had spent the last several hours trying to kill him. His beard was encased in ice. His eyes were the eyes of a man who has been looking at death for long enough to have made a kind of accommodation with it and is now confronted unexpectedly with the alternative. His voice, when it came, was a sound made by a throat that the cold had done considerable damage to. "Wagon," he managed. "Axel, been walking." Colt was already across the room to the woman and the child. He pushed back the wrapping around the small face. A boy 6 years old perhaps, with a color in his cheeks that was not the healthy color of cold, but the particular brightness of high fever. His skin hot and dry under Colt's palm. His eyes moving behind closed lids in the restless, unseeing motion of a child in the grip of a temperature that had climbed beyond comfort and was working towards something more serious. Colt looked at the child for one long second. Then he turned to the fire, added 2 more pieces of wood, and reached for the cloth bag that old May Whitfield had given him on his last night in Drystone. The bag of dried barks and roots and leaves that he had carried for 3 months in Buck's pack, and then transferred to a shelf in the cabin, waiting for whatever it was that old May had understood he would eventually need it for. He found the willow bark by smell. Dried and brittle, it broke into pieces between his fingers, filling the cabin with its faint, astringent scent as he dropped pieces into the small iron pot hanging over the fire. He worked quickly and without speaking, and the man on the floor of his cabin watched him through ice-crusted eyes and did not say anything either, because there was nothing to say, and Colt's hands knew what they were doing, and the boy needed the medicine, and sometimes the kindest thing a person can do is simply work. The foundation. The boy's name was Cass. Colt learned this on the second morning, when the child's fever had dropped enough for him to open his eyes and look around the cabin with the slow, wondering attention of someone returning from a place they cannot quite remember visiting. The eyes that opened were gray, the clear, pale gray of creek water over limestone, and they moved around the room with a deliberate thoroughness that suggested, even in illness, a mind that wanted to understand what it was looking at. They stopped on Colt. "Are you a mountain man?" the boy asked. His voice was a thread barely there, but the question in it was genuine. Not a child's casual wondering, but a real inquiry from a child who had apparently spent some portion of his fever time constructing a framework for the situation he found himself in, and had arrived at Mountain Man as the most adequate available category. Colt was kneeling by the fire adding wood. He looked over his shoulder at the boy. "Something like that," he said. Cass considered this with the gravity of a 6-year-old receiving important information. Then, apparently satisfied, he closed his eyes again and slept. Across the cabin, on the other low bench that Colt had built against the north wall, the boy's father had been awake for some time, watching Colt with an expression that occupied the complex territory between gratitude and something that was not quite disbelief, but was close to it. The man's name was Harwick Aldred. Colt had learned this and the names of his wife and son during the night's intermittent wakeful periods. The pieces of information exchanged in the practical shorthand of people managing a crisis together. Blythe Aldred sat beside her son, her hand resting on his chest in the monitoring way of mothers who have spent a frightening night listening to their child breathe, making sure each breath is followed by another. She was a composed woman, composed in the way of people who have decided that falling apart is not useful, and have therefore decided not to do it. Though the decision had cost her something visible in the tight lines around her eyes. Harwick Aldred sat up slowly wincing and looked at the wall behind the hearth. He had looked at it the night before they all had. It was impossible not to, the firelight making the exposed quartz sections blaze with a warmth that was not entirely explained by the fire itself. But the night before had been about survival, and the boy and the wall had remained in the periphery, a fact registered and filed away for later consideration. Now, in the grey morning light filtering through the cabin's single small window, Harwick looked at it with a different quality of attention. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I worked the Nevada mines for 5 years, out of Elko before the carpentry." He was still looking at the wall. "Comstock extension mostly. Some placer work on the side. I know what I'm looking at." Colt looked at him. "That's not a vein." Harwick continued, his voice measured and careful. "That's not a strike." He turned from the wall and met Colt's eyes directly. "I've seen men pull fortunes from seams 1/4 of an inch wide. What's in that wall behind your fire would make those men weep." He paused. "How much of it is there?" "The whole wall," Colt said. "Far as I've been able to determine. I haven't taken the outer layer off the full surface yet." Harwick was quiet again. Outside, the blizzard was still going, but differently than the night before. The roaring fury of it had subsided into a steady, purposeful snowfall. The cabin held its temperature with a steadiness that continued to impress Colt every time he thought about the engineering of it. The cave stone at the back doing work that no constructed wall could have done. "You need to file a claim," Harwick said finally. "Formal claim at the land office, not nearby." He glanced toward the direction that Drystone lay in. "Dalton, county seat, is 40 miles south. The land office there is run by a man named Aldous Price, who I know personally. Honest man, does the work correctly." He looked back at Colt steadily. "You need to do it before the spring thaw brings anyone else into these canyons." Colt looked at the fire. "I've been somewhat occupied." "You've been building," Harwick said. And there was no judgment in it. Only the observation of a man who had looked at the cabin walls and the carefully engineered hearth and understood what he was seeing. Which is exactly right. But the building and the claiming need to happen in that order, and you've done the building. He paused. "The claim protects what you've built. Without it, what you've got is a discovery. With it, you've got a foundation." Colt sat with that word. Foundation. It sat in the same register as the other word he had been carrying for 3 months. The word the Reverend had made a weapon of, and which the canyon had quietly been dismantling into something else entirely. He nodded. The blizzard released the canyon on the morning of the 3rd day. It did not end dramatically. It simply stopped. 1 hour driving snow and cutting wind, the next hour still, and white and so quiet that Colt could hear a branch falling somewhere up the canyon slope, the soft percussion of it carrying through the cold air with perfect clarity. He went outside first, breaking through the snow that had accumulated against the door, and stood on the canyon floor in the aftermath of the storm. The world was remade. Every rough edge and uneven surface had been smoothed and covered the rocky canyon floor. Now a continuous white expanse broken only by the dark line of the creek, which was still running in its deep channel gray-green against the snow. The canyon walls rose from the white floor in bands of red and gray rock. The snow caught in every ledge and crack so that the walls themselves had become a map of their own irregularities drawn in white. He thought about what it had cost to build the thing that had kept him and 3 strangers alive through the last 3 days. Every log, every notched corner, every fistful of clay chinked into a gap. Buck hauling timber across the valley floor through October, and his own hands bleeding and healing and hardening over the same weeks. He thought about the wall behind his hearth, and what Harwick Aldred had confirmed in the quiet voice of a man who had no reason to exaggerate. He went back inside. Cass spent his days of recovery constructing something with a small knife and a piece of scrap wood that Colt had set aside as too small for structural use. The boy worked with focused intensity that reminded Colt of himself in a way he could not have explained. The way a person's concentration on work they have chosen themselves is a different thing from their concentration on work they have been assigned. On the afternoon of the second clear day, when Harwick had assessed the trail and determined the family's remaining horse could manage the journey south to Dalton, Cass presented Colt with the results of his woodworking. It was a hawk. Small, rough, the carving of a 6-year-old working with a small knife, and the ambition that outpaces skill but knows exactly what it intends. A bird in flight, wing spread, tail fanned its head, lifted as if it has just caught a thermal and is deciding what to do with it. Cass held it out with both hands. "It's a hawk," he said, "like the one that lives in your canyon." Colt took it. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the rough wood and the intentionality in every cut, the evidence of hours of quiet, concentrated effort, from a boy who had been sick enough to die 3 days ago and had chosen this as the work of his recovery. "It's a good hawk," Colt said. He meant it completely. Harwick appeared behind his son and put a hand on the boy's shoulder. He looked at Colt over Cass's head with an expression that did not require interpretation. Then he extended his own hand, and Colt took it, and the handshake was the kind that 2 men exchange when words have not been invented yet for what they mean to communicate. Before they left, Blythe Aldred took Colt's hand in both of hers and held it for a moment. Her eyes said what her voice apparently could not find a way to say. He stood at the canyon entrance and watched them go, 3 figures and a horse moving south through the white canyon floor, growing smaller until the bend of the canyon wall took them from sight. The canyon was very quiet after they left. He looked at the hawk in his palm. Then he put it on the shelf above the hearth where it would catch the firelight from both the flames and the quartz wall behind them. Colt went to Dalton 2 weeks later, when the snow had settled and the trail was navigable, riding Buck for the first time, the mule submitting to this new arrangement with the resigned cooperation of an animal that has decided to be flexible about certain things. The land office was on Dalton's main street, a proper town of 800 people that felt after months in the canyon like a city. Aldous Price, the land agent, was a spare man of 50, with the focused competence of someone who has spent decades doing a specific job well and has lost patience for doing it any other way. He asked precise questions. He listened to the answers with complete attention. He drew out the claim forms with the practiced efficiency of a man who understands that the difference between a correctly completed form and an incorrectly completed one is the difference between a mine and a legal dispute. At the end of the filing, he looked up and said with the careful neutrality of a man who has learned to be careful with the hopes of people who sit in his office, "Son, I'd recommend you find yourself an assessor before the spring. Get it properly evaluated. What you're describing, if it's as you describe it, will require professional documentation to protect." Colt rode Buck back to Hollow Wind Canyon with the completed claim papers folded in his coat pocket next to the stone. The stone was warm as it always was. Professor Harlan Cross arrived in Hollow Wind Canyon on a Tuesday in March, when the snow was still thick on the canyon floor, but retreating, the creek running high and fast with the early melt. Cross was 55 years old, a geologist and assayer from Denver, who had spent 30 years moving through the mining territories of the American West with a rock hammer and chemical testing supplies, and the particular patience of a man who understands that the Earth's secrets reveal themselves on geological time and cannot be rushed. He had the look of someone who spends most of his time outdoors and has been shaped by that time into something spare and efficient, weathered in the way of good tools that have been used correctly and often. Harwick Aldred had sent him. Colt had received the letter in early February explaining that Harwick had spoken to Cross in Dalton, that Cross was a man of integrity, whose assessments were trusted throughout 4 territories, and that if Colt would agree to a visit, Cross would come. Colt had written back with directions. Cross arrived alone with his tools in saddlebags and the unhurried manner of a man on a professional call he has made many times. He introduced himself at the cabin door with a brief, firm handshake and a direct look that established immediately that he was not going to waste time on pleasantries. Colt brought him inside and showed him the wall. Cross stood in front of it for a long time without speaking. He worked through his examination with the methodical sequence of someone following a protocol established by long practice. He took samples of the outer dark layer and examined them under his hand lens, making notes in a small leather journal. He exposed additional sections of the quartz with his rock hammer, careful and precise, removing the dark crust in controlled pieces. He traced the gold veins with a fingertip, following their branches and intersections, occasionally stopping to measure with a small brass instrument from his bag. He applied testing acids to the exposed metal and noted the results without expression. Colt sat on the bench near the fire and waited. He was not anxious. He understood that the wall was what it was, regardless of what Cross said about it, and that Cross's expertise would either confirm or complicate what Colt already understood to be true. What Cross's assessment would change was everything downstream of that fact: the claim, the protection, the ability to act on the discovery in the world beyond Hollowwind Canyon. Cross worked for nearly 2 hours. He filled 4 pages of his small journal with figures and observations. He stood back from the wall at intervals and looked at it from a distance, then went forward again and looked at it up close, the way a person looks at something they are trying to understand from multiple scales simultaneously. Finally, he turned around. He stood with his journal in one hand and his rock hammer in the other, and he looked at Colt across the cabin with an expression that was not dramatic and was not performed, but contained in its professional restraint. Something that was unmistakably the suppressed excitement of a man who has spent 30 years looking at rocks and has just seen something he did not previously believe was possible. "Son," Cross said, his voice even and deliberate, "I've been assessing mines and mineral formations across 4 territories for 30 years. Nevada, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah. I have assessed everything from gravel placer operations to the Comstock itself." He paused. "I have never in 30 years seen a formation like this one." He opened his journal and turned it so Colt could see the figures on the current page. "This is not a gold strike," Cross continued. "A gold strike is what you find when you're lucky. This is something different. The concentration of metallic gold in this quartz matrix is extraordinary. The formation scale is extraordinary. The purity of the metal is extraordinary." He closed the journal. "If the formation extends through the mountain to anything like the depth I suspect it may based on the surface indicators, you are not looking at a mine." He looked at Colt steadily. "You are looking at a treasury." The word sat in the cabin's warm air. Colt looked at the wall, at the firelight on the white quartz and the gold threads burning in it, at the small carved hawk on the shelf above the hearth, catching the same light from its fixed upward-looking angle. "The claim," he said. "Filed correctly," Cross said. "I reviewed the documentation before I came. Aldous Price did it properly. Your rights are established and protected." He paused. "What you need now is to manage how this becomes known. A discovery of this magnitude improperly disclosed brings the wrong kind of attention. You've seen what gold rushes do to a place." He looked around the cabin at the solid walls and the carefully planned hearth, and the evidence of deliberate, intelligent construction in every detail of the space. "You've built something real here. The question is how you build what comes next without losing what you've already built." They talked for 3 hours that afternoon. Cross's practical knowledge of mining law and claim management laying out a course of action that was careful and staged and designed to bring Colt the protection he needed without the chaos he did not. When Cross left the next morning, he carried with him a full set of documentation signed and witnessed that formally established Colt Hadley as the sole legal owner of the Hollowwind Formation. He also carried Colt suspected a level of personal excitement that the man's professional demeanor was working very hard to contain. Spring came to Hollowwind Canyon slowly and completely, the snow retreating from the valley floor by degrees, the creek settling from its meltwater roar into the steady conversational flow that would be its summer voice, the aspen along the canyon walls, putting out their first pale leaves in a green, so new it looked almost translucent in the April light. And with the spring people came. They did not come all at once. They came in the careful, considered way that serious people come to a significant place when the word has been passed through trustworthy hands, rather than shouted from a rooftop. Harwick Aldred came first with Blythe and Cass, and a wagon loaded with tools and timber, and the materials of a man who intends to build something permanent. He pulled up to the canyon entrance in the late afternoon of a warm April day, and stood looking at the valley with the assessing eye of a carpenter, and the informed eye of a man who had seen it in winter, and was now seeing it in its warmer promise. "Good valley," he said. "Yes," Colt said. Harwick began building the next morning. A family named Cook came in May, then 2 brothers named Spratt, then a widow named Elspeth Rourke, with her 2 teenage sons who had heard the story from the Cooks and made the journey from their failing homestead in the Eastern Flats with everything they owned in a single wagon. Colt talked with each of them. He was clear about the terms. Access to the creek and its place of gold was available to anyone who agreed to work. Honestly share fairly and contribute to the building of the settlement. There was no rushing, no claim jumping, no violence. There was instead a town. It grew slowly, which was the right speed for a thing that needed to hold. By midsummer, there were 40 people in Hollow Wind Canyon living in structures of varying degrees of completion and permanence. But all of them real. All of them the work of people who had decided to stay. A cleared central area had become, by common agreement, the town's gathering place. Harwick Aldred had built a structure that functioned as a meeting hall and a trading post simultaneously. Its walls solid and its roof watertight. Someone, without consulting Colt, had put up a sign, Hadley Hollow. He saw it one morning on his way down from the cabin, a neat blank sign above the door of Harwick's building. The letters cut with care into the wood. He stopped and looked at it for a moment. He thought about what it meant to have a place carry your name, the weight of that, and also the unexpected warmth of it. The feeling of being acknowledged not as a charity case or a problem to be managed, but as the person who had started something that others had found worth joining. He left the sign where it was. The morning that Reverend Silas Vane appeared at the entrance to Hadley Hollow was a morning in August high summer, with the kind of blue sky that Colorado produced, as if to compensate for its winters, a blue so deep and clear it seemed to go on past the sky itself. Colt saw them coming from the cabin's doorway. He had been sitting on the bench he had placed outside the door in the morning sun, watching the town below. Wake up the carved hawk in his hand, turning it over the way he sometimes did in quiet moments. A thinking habit he had developed without noticing it. He saw the group moving up the valley from the south entrance and recognized the lead figure by his posture before he could make out the face. Reverend Silas Vane walked the way he had always walked, with the upright, measured tread of a man who is accustomed to being watched and has made his peace with it. He was wearing his good coat and carried his Bible in the crook of his left arm. Behind him came 4 men from Drystone Men Colt recognized by shape and gait. Among them, hanging slightly back from the others, was Jasper Vane. The Reverend's son was 23 now, broader than Colt remembered, and he walked with the particular posture of a man who has been brought along on an errand he did not choose and cannot leave. When the group drew close enough for faces to be visible, Jasper's eyes found Colt's across the distance between them, and something moved in them that was not quite shame and not quite defiance. It was the expression of a man who has been carrying a specific knowledge for 2 years and has not found a comfortable place to set it down. Colt held that look for a moment, long enough for the acknowledgement to be complete, then moved his eyes back to the Reverend. Some accounts settled themselves simply by being witnessed. Colt put the hawk in his coat pocket. He finished his coffee, slowly looking out over the settlement below him. Then he stood and walked down to meet them. He arrived at the trading post where Harwick Aldred was already standing in the doorway, approximately 30 seconds before Vane's group did. Behind Harwick, drifting out from the various activities of a summer morning, with the unhurried inevitability of a community that has developed the instincts of one, were others. The Cooks, the Spratt brothers, Elspeth Rourke and her sons. Professor Cross, who happened to be in the settlement on a documentation visit, appeared at the edge of the gathering with his hands in his coat pockets and his leather document folder under his arm. Vane stopped when he saw the assembled people. He had been prepared for Colt. He had not been prepared for a community. He recovered quickly. He was good at recovery. 20 years of pastoral management had made him expert at rapid recalibration. He looked at the gathering with the practiced expression of a man surveying a congregation, taking its measure, deciding on his approach. Then he looked at Colt. His expression in that moment was not what Colt had expected. He had expected the cold calm from the meeting house. What he saw instead was something more complicated, a composure that was still present, but was working harder than it had ever needed to work in dry stone, pressing against something underneath it that wanted very much to be acknowledged. He had been a powerful man in the world he knew. He had come to a place where that world's terms did not apply. "Colt," he said. "Reverend was," Colt said. Vane drew a measured breath. He opened his Bible to a page he had apparently marked in advance, which told Colt the speech had been prepared on the ride from Dry Stone. He spoke about community obligation. He spoke about the bonds created by shared upbringing and shared provision, about the debts that accrue when a child is fed and sheltered and raised within the labor and generosity of a community of faith. He spoke about those debts as a simple accounting, the kind any honest man would recognize. He spoke carefully and at length, and he never raised his voice. When he was finished, the settlement was quiet. Then Professor Cross stepped forward. He was holding his leather document folder open, with the unhurried efficiency of a man who has prepared for exactly this moment. "I'm Harlan Cross," he said, addressing Vane with the courteous directness of someone who has no personal stake in the situation's emotional content and is therefore free to deal with its practical reality. "Geological assessor licensed by the Colorado Territorial Government. I've also served as legal witness to the claim documentation on this property." He removed a sheaf of papers from the folder, removed a pen. The claim on the hollow information was filed in Dalton at the county land office on the 7th of January of this year. It was filed correctly and completely. It has been reviewed by the Territorial Land Commissioner's office and confirmed. He held the papers so that their existence was visible to the assembled group. This land, this canyon, and the mineral rights pertaining to the formation within it belong without qualification or condition to Colt Hadley. He put the papers back in the folder and closed it. Any claim based on the prior relationship of the owner to any outside community or organization has no legal standing under territorial law, he added. "I'd be happy to correspond with any attorney the Reverend wishes to engage, if that would be helpful." The silence after Cross finished was a different quality of silence from the silence after Vane finished. One had been the silence of people waiting for a response. The other was the silence of a conversation that has reached its conclusion. Vane stood very still. He looked at the papers in Cross's folder. He looked at the assembled community behind Colt, 40 people in various postures of attention, none of them hostile, none of them theatrical, simply present in the way that people are present when something is happening that they have collectively decided to witness. He looked at Harwick Aldred in the trading post doorway. He looked at the sign above that doorway, Hadley Hollow. He looked finally at Colt, who had not moved and had not spoken since his single word of greeting. Colt looked back. He did not feel what he had expected to feel in this moment, the hot satisfaction of a long account being settled. He felt instead something quieter and more complete than that, the feeling of a circle drawing itself closed, not with a bang, but with the simple inevitable meeting of its own beginning and its end. He said quietly, "You gave me the stone, Reverend. You just forgot that stone remembers fire." Vane looked at him for one more long moment. Something moved across his face that Colt could not precisely name. It was the expression of a man looking at evidence he has spent a long time trying not to see and has finally run out of ways to avoid. Then the Reverend closed his Bible, the small sound of it final and complete, and turned and walked back the way he had come. Behind him, Jasper Vane was the last of the Drystone men to turn away. He paused for just a moment, and his eyes found Colt's one more time. The look that passed between them was brief and carried no words. It was simply the acknowledgement of two men who both knew the full truth of what had happened in the storehouse 2 years ago, and both knew that the truth had finally arrived at the place it had always been heading. Jasper turned and followed his father. Nobody watched them go with triumph. Nobody said anything pointed or celebratory. The settlement simply returned gradually to the sounds and movements of its morning, as if the interruption had been noted and processed, and the day's work was waiting. Harwick came out of the trading post doorway and stood beside Colt. Breakfast, he said. Blythe's made enough for everyone. Colt looked at the south entrance of the canyon where Vane's group had disappeared. He thought about what happens to power when the story it depends on stops being believed, when the evidence against it becomes too large and too solid to be managed by interpretation. He thought about Declan Holt, the red-haired boy, and whether the truth had finally found its way back to him. He turned and followed Harwick inside for breakfast. Wren Dawes came to Hadley Hollow on a morning in July of the following year. Colt was at the hearth, his back to the door, adding a piece of wood to the fire and watching the way the quartz wall caught the morning light. The golden threads in it doing what they always did in early daylight, glowing with a warmth that was simultaneously the reflection of the fire and something that seemed to come from deeper in the stone itself. He heard the footstep on the threshold and turned. For a moment he simply looked. Wren was older than Colt remembered, which was obvious and also surprising the way it is always surprising to see the effects of time on a person you carry in memory at a fixed age. He was broader through the shoulders, the product of continued smithing work, and there was something different in his face that had not been there when he was 21 years old. Standing in the dark between the meeting house and the storehouse, pressing a lead rope into Colt's hand. He had lived through something. It was visible in the way he held himself. He stood in the doorway of the cabin with his hat in his hands. The same battered hat he'd worn the night he pressed the lead rope into Colt's hand at the settlement's edge. Colt noticed this and said nothing about it. Wren looked around at what the interior had become. At the proper plank floor. At the second room built off the cave's left chamber. At the shelves along the north wall, organized and stocked with the provisions of a man who has learned exactly what he needs and has made sure to have it. At the hearth and the wall behind it, the quartz now fully exposed across its entire 10 by 10 feet, the golden veins burning in the morning fire. At the carved hawk on the shelf above the hearth. Wren looked at that for a moment longer than the other things. Then he looked at Colt. "Is there work here for a blacksmith?" he asked. His voice was the same as Colt remembered, lower maybe with the added resonance of a few more years in it, but the same in its fundamental quality. The voice of a man who says what he means and has no interest in saying things he doesn't. Colt looked at him for a long moment. "Come in," he said. "Close the door." Wren stepped inside and set his hat on the table. He walked to the hearth and stood in front of the quartz wall, the way a man stands in front of something he has been told about and is now confirming with his own eyes. He reached out and put his palm flat against the exposed gold-veined surface, holding it there. "Warm," he said. "Always has been," Colt said. Wren took his hand back and looked at it, then looked at the wall again. He was quiet for a time in the way that was native to him. The silence of a man who is thinking something through completely before he commits to expressing any part of it. "I told my father," he said finally, "about the apple, about what you saw in the storehouse." He looked at the fire rather than at Colt. 6 months after you left. Told him in the smithy, just the two of us. He didn't say much, but he stopped going to the Reverend's evening meetings after that. Then a few others stopped. It went slow, but it went. Colt was quiet, taking this in. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "No," Wren agreed. "I didn't have to." He turned from the fire and looked at Colt directly with the full, undeflected attention that had always been one of his most identifiable qualities. "The axe," he said. "Did you waste it on anger?" Colt thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. He thought about Sully and Marsh at the canyon entrance, and the axe held in both hands, and the choice he had made to set it down as a tool rather than raise it as a weapon. He thought about every morning since then, when he had picked it up and used it to build rather than to punish. "Not once," he said. Wren nodded. Something in his face settled the last piece of a long-held weight finding its resting place. "Then I'd say you built exactly what you intended." He looked around the cabin one more time, and through the window at the town visible below the smoke from cooking fires, the sound of Elspeth Rourke's students reciting something in the schoolroom. The movement of people going about a morning that was entirely ordinary because they had built the kind of place where ordinary mornings were possible. He turned back to Colt. "Is there work here for a blacksmith?" "There's always been a place for you here, Wren," Colt said. "I just waited for you to find your way." Something moved across Ren's face, then brief and complete, the expression of a man arriving somewhere he has been traveling toward for a long time, without being entirely certain it would still be there when he arrived. "Good," he said quietly. "Then let's get to work." The smithy went up at the south end of Hadley Hollow's main street in August. A proper building with a forge that Wren built, to specifications he carried in his head from years of watching his father work. It was solid and well positioned, and the sound of the hammer that came from it in the working hours was one of the most satisfying sounds Colt had ever heard. A clean, purposeful voice that said useful things were being made. By the time the aspens began to turn in late September, Hadley Hollow had grown to 60 people. Harwick's trading post was the commercial heart of the settlement, stocked now with a range of goods that reflected the seriousness of the community's intentions. Elspeth Rourke's school occupied a room in the trading post's east wing, and the sound of children working through their lessons was a sound Colt had not been aware of missing until he began to hear it every morning. A proper stable stood at the north end of the clearing, managed by one of the Spratt brothers. Plans had been discussed in the town's regular evening meetings for a mill, using the creek's flow, and for a road south to Dalton that would make the winter journey practical rather than an act of endurance. A town built on ground that had been given to him as the location of his ending. In the weeks after Wren's arrival, Colt had written a letter to old May Whitfield. He had sent it through one of the Dalton traders who made the route east, not knowing if it would reach her. Not knowing if Vane's diminished authority in Drystone had created a climate where a letter from Colt Hadley could arrive without consequence to its recipient. He had sent it anyway. It had said very little. It had said that he had found the warmth she had told him to listen for. It had said that he understood now what she had meant. It had said thank you in the plain language of someone who means it without decoration. 3 weeks later, a small package arrived with a Dalton trader who said a woman matching old May's description had pressed it into his hands at the eastern trailhead and asked that it be delivered to Hadley Hollow. Inside the package was a single item, a small cloth pouch tied with the same kind of thin cord that had closed the herb bag she had given him on his last night in Drystone. Inside the pouch were seeds, a dozen of them dark and small, from a plant Colt recognized by the papery husks as the same willowbark herb whose dried version had brought Cass Aldred's fever down on the worst night of the December blizzard. There was no note. There did not need to be. Colt planted the seeds in a sheltered corner of the canyon where the south-facing rock collected the most heat in a patch of soil he had improved with creek sediment over the winter. He watered them through the dry late summer weeks with the same care he had brought to every other act of building in this canyon. By October, 4 of them had taken root and were showing their first true leaves. He looked at them for a long time the morning he first noticed them clearly established in the soil. Then he went back to work. The autumn of 1881 came to Hollowwind Canyon in the same colors as every autumn before it, and every autumn that would follow the aspen on the canyon walls, going from green to gold in their annual extravagance, the red rock above them, deepening in the cooler light. The sky, the particular impossible blue of high country September. 2 years. To the month, within a few days of the morning, Colt Hadley had walked out of Drystone on the red dust road and not looked back. He sat on the bench outside his door in the late afternoon light of a September Thursday, with the town below him making the sounds that towns make at the end of a working day. Fires being lit and tools being set down and voices calling back and forth across the settlement's clearing. He could hear the ring of Wren's hammer from the smithy at the south end of the main street, a clean metallic voice in the canyon's evening quiet. Buck was beside him. The old mule had retired himself from active hauling work sometime in the spring, simply declining one morning to be hitched and standing in his corner with the air of an animal that has decided the working portion of its arrangement has been fulfilled. Colt had not argued. Buck now spent his days moving between the cabin area and the grassy patches in the canyon's midsection, and his evenings here beside the bench, his head dropping occasionally to rest against Colt's shoulder with the comfortable weight of long companionship. Colt had the hawk in one hand. He turned it over the way he always did, feeling the rough wood and the intention in it. The small ridges left by a 6-year-old's knife cuts that had dried into permanence. Cass Aldred was 8 now, and attended Elspeth Rourke's school with the serious observant attention of a boy who had decided learning was worth his full effort. He arrived at Colt's door on a regular basis, with questions that ranged across subjects from the geological properties of quartz to the best method for setting a rabbit snare to the history of the people whose flint points still sat on the shelf in the cave's third chamber. Colt answered every question as fully as he could. He reached into his coat pocket and took out the stone. He held it alongside the hawk, one in each hand. The stone was warm as it always was, faintly and persistently warm in the way of something that has been carrying heat for a very long time and has no intention of stopping. He thought about old May Whitfield's face at the fence line in the pre-dawn gray, the patience in it, the quality of a woman who has seen a great deal of what the world does to people and has not been made cynical by the seeing, but only more precise in her understanding of it. He thought about what she had known or suspected, or simply intuited, in the way that some people develop an intuition for the hidden properties of things, that the place they were sending him was not what they thought it was, that the stone remembered fire, that the warmth was there for the listening. He put the stone back in his pocket. He put the hawk on the bench beside him and looked at it in the angled light. A 6-year-old had made it with a small knife and the ambition that outpaces skill and knows exactly what it intends. He thought that was the right way to build anything. With ambition that outpaces your current skill and the absolute clarity of intention that does not wait for the skill to catch up before it starts. The hammer rang once more from the south end of the settlement and then fell silent. The day's work done. The smoke rose from 60 fires into the September blue. Colt looked at all of it, at the canyon that had been given to him as a grave and had instead become the ground of everything that mattered, at the walls of red and gray rock that had stood through geological time unchanged and had offered in their ancient indifference the one thing that the warmth of Drystone's communal hearth had never quite managed to provide. Not judgment, not conditional belonging, not the measured generosity of a community that counts what it gives and expects an appropriate return of gratitude and compliance. Something older and more reliable than any of that. Stone that remembered fire. The deep, patient warmth of a thing that had been formed in the earth's own heat and had been waiting for longer than human memory could reach for someone to come along and listen carefully enough to find it. He had been given a stone. He had listened for its warmth. He had found it. And from that finding, one deliberate, unglamorous, bone-tired day at a time, he had built this. Not just the cabin behind him. Not just the quartz wall with its gold threaded through it like captured sunlight. Not just the legal claim that made it his in the language of courts and documents. He had built a place where people could come with nothing but their willingness to work honestly and their need for a fair chance, and find both the work and the chance waiting for them. He had built a place where a widow and her sons could start over, where a carpenter and his family could put down roots that no preacher's verdict could pull up, where a blacksmith who had stayed behind could eventually find his way too, where a boy who had been sick enough to die in a December blizzard could grow up asking questions that deserved answers in a school that intended to provide them. He had been 19 years old and penniless and cast out with nothing but a borrowed mule and a sharpened axe and a small dark stone that was inexplicably warm in his coat pocket. He was 21 now, and the canyon below him held 60 people and their futures, and the stone was still warm and the axe still hung on its hook inside the cabin door, oiled and sharp, ready for whatever needed building next. Wren's hammer had stopped for the evening, but it would start again in the morning. That was the thing about real work. It did not end. It only rested and then it continued. And in the continuing, it built something that outlasted the people who did it. Something that became over time simply the way a place was the ground on which the next generation would stand and decide what they intended to make of the time they had been given. Colt sat in the last of the September light with the old mule warm beside him and the hawk in his hand, and 60 fires sending their smoke into the evening sky. And he thought about the Reverend's careful, dismissive words on the night of his exile, the specific confidence of a man who had never once considered that the worthless place he was sending a worthless boy might have been waiting the whole time for exactly that boy to arrive. They had called it an exile. He had just learned it was a foundation.